We continue our discussion of blues-based rock in the first half of the 1970s. And now we turn our attention to the American blues-based rock bands. As I was saying in the last video, you would think that the American blues-based rock groups would take most of their influence from American blues. But the case is that most of these groups were very much influenced by the British bands of the 1960s. So it's strange that a lot of the blues influences in these groups come to them via the British groups, just like the blues has to leave the United States, go to Britain, and come back again for Americans to play it. But in many ways, that's not, in not all cases, but in many ways, that's the way it played out, simply because the Stones and Cream were so big that the people who were in these groups were teenagers when that music was out, and so that's the music that they got into. Well, when we talk about American blues rock, it's probably important to raise the style type Southern rock, because Southern rock is usually thought of as the most blues-based of the styles. And of those groups, we'll talk about the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner as sort of important representatives of Southern rock. But there is a bigger question with regard to Southern rock, and that is, what makes Southern rock Southern? Is it enough of a stylistic characteristic that, is it Southern rock because of where it comes from? If you didn't know where it came from, would you be able to tell that there was anything Southern about it? I mean, it's certainly a characteristic of the music, but isn't it an important stylistic characteristic? Well, I think it's worth thinking about. What made Southern rock Southern, in large part, was not only elements in the music itself, but the way in which it was packaged. And for those of you who are taking this course from outside the United States, it's probably important to recognize that Southern rock had its greatest sales in northern cities, simply because that's where most of the people were. Now, in this country, over the past few decades, there's been a migration from the north toward the south and toward areas in the south where there's greater opportunity and various kinds of things like that. But we're talking about the early 1970s, and so what constituted Southern was what constituted Southern in the minds of Northerners, who in many cases didn't have any direct contact with the South, had maybe not even been there. So for example, when you see Confederate flags and pickup trucks and big dogs and rifles and this kind of thing, this all stands for sort of Southern life, almost a kind of a cartoonish version of it. But one thing that the marketing people picked up on at these record labels is if they pushed that image, they could sell these groups and find a kind of marketing niche from that, because there's something interesting and heroic and fun-loving about images of the South. So not that these images are accurate, but they were almost sort of caricatures of things that people in the North had. So one thing that really pulls these groups together is their imaging as sort of their proud sort of demonstration of their Southern roots and their Southern identity. So we talk about the Allman Brothers Band, based out of Macon, Georgia. Probably the representative album, if you're going to grab one Allman Brothers album, would be At the Fillmore East, at least the sort of first version of the group from 1971. The Allman Brothers are Greg Allman, organist and lead vocalist of the group, and Duane Allman, virtuoso guitarist, much respected for his ability to play blues music, and had been a session player, played on some Stax recordings, had worked with Jerry Wexler in the late 1960s. Duane unfortunately dies in 1971, and the original bassist, Barry Oakley, dies in 1972, almost a year later, both the victim of motorcycle accidents. But what you'll hear in the first couple of Allman Brothers records, and especially At the Fillmore East, are the blues influences and the extended soloing. It's almost like when we talked about the Grateful Dead in the first course, we talked about how the group was essentially a live group, and capturing what they did on recording was kind of a difficult kind of thing. Well, it was that way with the Allman Brothers. The Allman Brothers were essentially a kind of improvisatory live group. And so when you listen to the live album, in some ways you're getting a more accurate representation of who they are than when you're listening to the studio recordings. Well, after Duane and Barry are gone, they bring in Chuck Leavell on piano. Dickie Betts, the other guitarist in the group, takes a more important role, and they have an album called Brothers and Sisters from 1973, and a hit song with Ramblin' Man. The other group that we talk about with regard to Southern rock a lot is a group called Leonard Skinner, named, interestingly enough, after their gym teacher back in Jacksonville, Florida, where the group originated. A gym teacher who had a strict rule about young men with long hair, right? So they thought, what could be better? We'll name the band after him. The group, I think, interestingly, was produced by Al Cooper, who had been the keyboard player on so many of those Bob Dylan hits from 1965, 1966. Al Cooper, a very interesting guy. But anyway, he produced a lot of those things based out of Atlanta, for a label I think that was called Southern Sounds. Leonard Skinner had a very radio-friendly style that really sort of wears its Southern heritage very much on its sleeve. Their album from 1972, the first album, is called Pronounced Leonard Skinnerd, and of course the big song on that album is Freebird. So all of you who've been watching these videos all this time and who have been wanting to say Freebird while I'm talking, now's your opportunity. There you go. Images of Southern life can also be found in tunes like Sweet Home Alabama from 1974, their second album called Second Helping, right? The sort of countrified Southern life kind of title that goes with that. So anyway, Leonard Skinner may be a more sort of song-oriented kind of group. The Allman Brothers may be a more kind of jam-oriented kind of group. Other groups in from the Southern rock style we should point out, the Charlie Daniels Band. Charlie Daniels, originally coming out of North Carolina, had been a session musician in Nashville, had actually played bass on a couple of those late 60s Dylan records, as I understand it. Their biggest hit, the Charlie Daniels Band biggest hit, was probably something very late in the decade, 1979, called The Devil Went Down to Georgia. But a lot of these other Southern rock groups have talked about what an important figure Charlie Daniels was in encouraging them and in mentoring them. He was almost a generation older than a lot of these guys, and so had a lot more experience in the music business and was able to give them some advice based on that experience. We should also talk about the Marshall Tucker Band coming out of South Carolina. Probably the most representative song for them is from 1973, called Can't You See? I mentioned in the last video that what constitutes sort of blues rock, Southern rock, would you think that Texas, for example, was Southern? Well, certainly it's Southern geographically, but it's not really it's thought of as part of the South. It's really thought of more as, well, Texas in this country, or the Southwest if you're going to think about a region. But some of probably the most important group to come out of Texas is ZZ Top during this period. Texas-based blues rock, and probably the two most representative tunes for them might be La Grange from 1973 and Tush from 1975. If Texas is not South, well then probably Mexico is not going to be considered sort of South in terms of Southern rock either, but the Mexican influence is very much heard in the music of guitarist Carlos Santana, even though his group comes out of the same San Francisco psychedelic scene that developed artists like the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane. Again, he combines together jazz, blues, improvisation, but adds the Latin rhythm kind of thing. The first big hit the group had was a tune called Black Magic Woman in 1970, which is a very close cover of a track that had been recorded by Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green on the guitar in 1968. Of course, most Americans didn't know that version. They knew the Santana version. That's the one that still gets played on FM radio the most in this country, classic rock radio the most in this country, and that is Black Magic Woman, the Santana version from 1970. But if you really want to hear the Latin rhythms, probably the most representative song is Evil Ways from 1970. So the question is Texas or Mexico Southern rock? Probably not, even though geographically it's Southern. And those of you who, sort of taking the course from outside the United States, it may be difficult to understand why we Americans see a big distinction there when geographically they should be grouped together. But again, it has to do with sort of cultural identifications of different regions and lifestyles, and Texas lifestyle and North Carolina lifestyle are not seen as really being the same thing, even though geographically they're south of the more industrial north. Other American blues rock that's worthy of note, and I'll go through these very quickly because we haven't got a lot of time to spend on each of these groups. Steppenwolf, led by John Kay, coming out of Los Angeles with their 1968 hit Born to Be Wild. One of the lyrics in that, heavy metal thunder, is often thought to be the first mention of heavy metal. So for those of you who are sort of following the beginnings of heavy metal, that's an important track. It was featured in the 1969 film Easy Rider, which starred Peter Fonda and had a lot to do with motorcycles. We should mention Three Dog Night, coming out of Los Angeles, a vocal group of 3 singers that were initially produced by Beach Boy Brian Wilson, but didn't really have success until they left Brian Wilson. A good example of their sound, sort of blue-eyed soul, sort of harmony vocal sound, is from 1970, Mama Told Me Not to Come. Coming out of Flint, Michigan, Grand Funk Railroad, led by guitarist, songwriter, and singer Mark Farner, were deeply rooted in 1960s soul and blues. Probably the most representative early example of their style is a track called I'm Your Captain, Closer to Home, 1970, which has not only the blues elements of what they do, but also a kind of a more sort of ambitious orchestral element that happens in that tune. A little bit later, they have their first #1 hit with We're an American Band in 1973. So an important sort of blues-based, or at least black pop-oriented kind of group in the first half of the 1970s. Often not given their due, but a group that sold a lot of records and got a lot of people to show up at their concerts. Another group, as we move deeper into the decade, Aerosmith, coming out of Boston, initially arising in the eyes of some people as a kind of American version of the Rolling Stones, because Joe Perry and Steven Tyler together cut an image very much like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. A representative song from Aerosmith might be Walk This Way from 1975, which is especially interesting because it was later released as an important rock-rap crossover record in 1986 when Aerosmith did the song, at least Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, did the song together with Run DMC. If you've never seen the video, when we talk about the rise of rap, we'll talk about that video. It's a very important kind of juxtaposition of rock culture in the 80s based on what we're talking about here in the 70s and the rise of rap culture. And of course, it got played on MTV an awful lot and is representative of the tension between those two. Well, this concludes our discussion of blues rock on the American side of things. Let's next turn to progressive rock.